What's the most unsettling secret you've uncovered about someone you know well? My father burned down the drug house on our street. This was in the late 70s. Everyone in the neighborhood hated and feared that house. People would come and go at all hours, junkies would pass out in the yard, our cars and houses would get broken into. Police would visit but do nothing. After an old woman got beaten and robbed as she was walking her dog, my dad and his brother went and firebombed the place in the early morning hours. No one died, cops didn't give a shit, and the house was never rebuilt. For years I walked by the burnt out shell on my way to school. I always thought the drug has burned it down by accident. My mother told me the story after my father died. My uncle was a criminal but my father was a straight arrow working man. I was shocked to learn that about him. One of my good friends and co-workers just got arrested for sex with a minor last week. None of us had any idea, but apparently he's been a registered sex offender since 2017, so this isn't the first time. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, and feel like I'm mourning the death of a friend. For me, I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was raped by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the slut of the family. My dad's side is garbage. My mother lost her father to a failed heart surgery when she was 4. Her mother and little sister died a year later in a gas leak during the early hours of Easter Sunday, 1960. My mother luckily woke up in the middle of the night during the gas leak feeling confused and found her brother laying under the bathroom sink and brought him outside, both surviving. I didn't learn until just a few years ago that the gas leak was intentional. My bio-grandmother was so distraught after losing her husband a year earlier that she decided to kill herself and her 3 children. She left a note on the refrigerator, confirming the intent. I've always marveled at how complicated a specimen my mother is. So much of her emotional development stopped at age 5, and learning that little piece of the puzzle put things in perspective. For years my whole family believed my grandmother was dead. My grandpa told everyone she was hit by a car when my dad was 2. After he passed away, we discovered my grandpa just took my dad and uncle and moved to a different state without telling my grandma, and then changed his last name. Basically stole her kids from her. My dad lived his entire life thinking his mom was dead. He died before my grandpa and never learned the truth. We loved our grandpa. He was a hell of a fun guy to be around, and I learned an awful lot from him. Discovering he did something like that was pretty unsettling. I suppose it's possible my grandma was a bad person and my grandpa did it for his children's safety, but guess we'll never know. Edit, I'll add a couple more details since this got a little attention. He met another woman in the new state and had a 3rd son with her. He then had a falling out with that woman and tried to move away again and take all 3 boys, but the youngest decided to stay with his mom. My grandpa basically disowned him and turned the other 2 boys against him. He then left the 3rd boy $1.02 in his will when he passed. I didn't mean that uncle until after my grandpa passed, as my dad's best friend reached out to him to let him know his father died. He is now a very big part of our family and we all love him dearly. He was able to reconnect with my older uncle at my brother's wedding just a few months before the older uncle passed. Anyway, this follow-up story is what leads me to believe he didn't have the purest intentions when he left my biological grandma, since he was willing to disown his own son like that. I discovered my mom had a half-sister 3 years after my granddad passed away. My nan got a call and I felt like I should call her to take it instead of picking it up. My nan was explaining on the phone that this woman couldn't talk to my granddad because her dad was dead. I asked her who it was, because obviously my uncle and mum knew their dad was dead, and my nan had to explain that she was a child born out of wedlock that my granddad basically abandoned, to the point her whole existence was kept a secret, to the point she didn't even know her dad died. I feel sick when I think about it because she finally wanted to contact my granddad and she just found out on a random Sunday he had been gone for 3 years. I'll never meet her and it's unsettling to know I have a whole family out there I will never meet because of them. Apparently she looks just like my mom. I don't know how disturbing this is, it turned out pretty fantastic for one. But not for another. I was adopted, and told a silly, magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went, into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother, she died a year before I surged. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone. And I'm fine with that, I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled, physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory. And was raped by an orderly. And she discovered she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy. I was kidnapped. I grew up in a small town with my mom and stepdad. Hated the guy. Long story long, when I turned 16 I legally changed my name back to my mother's maiden name. I got a call like 3 weeks later from a random man asking me if this was my first, last and middle name, if my mother's middle name was blank, if I was born blank. I didn't know my birthplace but the rest checked out. This man was my brother I had never heard of, who then connected me to my legal guardian, my father also did not know existed. The legal name change alerted the cops in a different place of a 15-year-old missing persons report. Wild stuff. I have some recollections of myself playing with my great-grandpa as a little girl. We were super close, I loved the stories he told me and those nice jests that made me laugh. Great-grandpa passed away when I was 5 years old. A few months before he slept and never woke up again, he made a special dollhouse for me that I kept until my early teenage years. Though I was too young to get to know him, I was so sure he was a good person. My brother and all of my cousins are younger than me, but I do have 2 second cousins who are 7 and 8 years older than myself. They have a better recollection of great-grandpa, and according to them, he was a wise man. He used to take the boys outside to play, and despite being so old, he was so full of energy. He also offered good advice to them when things went wrong. Recently my great-aunt sat the 3 of us down and told us the truth about her dad. It turned out great-grandpa was a part of a political party that's now banned by the government of our country. Great-grandpa was responsible for the death of so many innocent people, among other horrific acts. I found out my ex-partner used to shoot animals with BB guns for fun with his brother. They had a score sheet. A friend told me that his father disconnected his grandfather that was suffering in a hospital bed. This person was terminal and the doctor told him, "This machine is keeping your father alive, it would be a shame if it malfunctioned while I am away having lunch." I have a lot of respect for these men. My aunt tried to passively kill my grandma by telling her nurse she was terminally agitated to begin the process for end-of-life care. Had her on a bunch of meds too when we visited her. It was fucked. Turned out my grandma was rich and my aunt wanted her money. Also my aunt stole her dying boyfriend's guns while he was dying in the hospital. I hope I don't ever see any of my blood family besides my mom ever again. I would not be surprised to find out my aunt was a serial killer most her life. My great-grandmother was simultaneously married to 3 separate persons. She was getting 3 of the men's paychecks at once. They were from various branches of the military. I had a friend from high school who I loved so much. I loved how non-threatening he was, and how kind he was, and how much fun we had together, and I loved that his favorite memory of his mother was how nice she dressed and how very pretty she was, and how much he loved hearing her heels click along the pavement when they went for walks in the city. Turns out he was a pedophile who molested his own toddler niece. He's in prison now. Fuck you, Kirk Wayne. You goddamn piece of shit, waste of space human being. My mother had an estranged uncle who was secret to my immediate family. Turns out he was a sex offender who completely left our family out of his life. He was hard to find for my mother. She had to use the offenders list to find him. She never saw him since he committed the act. I only learned about this because I met his son at a family reunion and my mother had to bring me up to the fact afterwards. He is a psychopath arsonist. He may have killed someone. I quit speaking with him decades ago. Motherfucker started a forest fire. I've got a friend whose pop is a serial killer. The FBI knows but doesn't have sufficient evidence to prove it in court. I had an uncle who was in prison for 23 years and was released a few years ago. He has since passed away, but anyway, after he got out of prison, he started coming over to our house for dinner. He turned a new leaf and found God, got an education somehow, and got fucking married in prison. He was apparently very loved and popular before the legal trouble, and everyone in my family seemed to forgive him by the time he got out. So he for a long while was invited over for dinner quite often. I sat around eating dinner and joking around with this guy and had no clue what he did, but after a few months I finally found out what he did, and it's a bunch of words I have a hard time putting together, but he was caught having full penetrative intercourse with a toddler. I learned that and flipped the fuck out. I ran downstairs where my parents were and yelled at them, how they could let this guy come in and eat with all of us and especially with my niece and nephews. They asked me why I was so pissed and I was like, WTF are you talking about? Of course I'm pissed and disgusted by this, how couldn't I be? Then my mom said, wait, how did you find out? I told them I talked with my other uncle, from my mom's side, and he told me everything. My mom turned white and started crying and said, I'm so sorry we let him hurt you, you were just a baby and didn't deserve that, please forgive us. I haven't talked to my parents since. One of my friends is now in jail for r / ping her brother __. One of my then friends confessed to pretending to have cancer for years. He had a cane and everything to help him walk because he had surgery in his leg and had part of his leg removed because the cancer. It was all lies.